The name was written down for the first time in 1865. Not the person. The person had existed for decades, had been born, had grown, had worked, had in some cases married, and had children of their own. But none of that had generated a government record with their name on it. Enslaved people in the United States did not appear in federal documents as named individuals. They appeared in census schedules as numbers, counted under the heading of their enslaver, tallied by age and sex, assigned no surname, no birthplace, no family relationship that the document would acknowledge. Then the war ended, and for a period of 6 years, between 1865 and 1872, a federal agency called the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands did something that had never been done at scale in American history. It wrote their names down. The Freedmen's Bureau, as it was commonly known, generated an estimated 4 million records across its 7 years of operation. Labor contracts, marriage registers, ration records, hospital logs, letters written on behalf of freed people to locate family members sold away during slavery, indenture agreements, complaints filed against former enslavers, land transactions. Each one a document that named a person who had not previously been named in any government file. For the descendants of enslaved Americans, those records are not historical artifacts. They are the only paper trail that connects a living family to a documented ancestor before emancipation. Congress defunded the Bureau in 1872. Here is what the Bureau actually built, before Congress decided it had built enough. The Freedmen's Bureau was established by Congress in March 1865, 1 month before the end of the Civil War. Its mandate was broad and deliberately vague: to manage the transition from slavery to freedom across 11 former Confederate states and the District of Columbia. In practice, that mandate required the Bureau to do simultaneously what no American government agency had attempted before: to administer land redistribution, to negotiate labor contracts between freed people and former enslavers, to establish schools, to provide medical care, to adjudicate disputes, and to create, from nothing, a documentary infrastructure for a population that the preceding legal order had systematically excluded from documentation. The Bureau operated through a network of assistant commissioners, superintendents, and local agents stationed across the South. The quality of their work varied. Some agents were genuinely committed to the Bureau's mission. Others were indifferent or actively hostile to it, and the resources available to any given office were rarely adequate to the scale of what was being asked. What the Bureau produced, despite these constraints, was a documentary record of extraordinary breadth and specificity. The marriage registers are where that specificity becomes most visible. During slavery, marriages between enslaved people had no legal standing. They could not be recorded. They could not be enforced. A couple could be separated by sale at any time, by the decision of an enslaver who had no legal obligation to recognize the relationship as binding. When emancipation came, the question of which formerly enslaved couples were legally married, and therefore entitled to the legal protections that marriage conveyed, including inheritance rights and the legitimacy of children, had no documentary answer. The Bureau's marriage registers were an attempt to create one. Couples came to Bureau offices across the South and registered their unions. The registers recorded names, ages, counties of origin, the names of former enslavers in some cases, and the length of the relationship. For couples who had been separated by sale and were now attempting to locate each other, or to establish that a relationship had existed before separation, the register was the only government document that would acknowledge what had happened to them. And here is where the bridge of relevance matters, because the experience of having your family's legal standing depend entirely on a government document that the government created, and then stopped maintaining, is not a condition unique to 1872. It is the operational description of what happens when a documentary infrastructure is built for a specific population and then defunded before that population has had time to fully use it. The records exist. The access to them is uneven. And the families who most need them are frequently the families with the fewest resources to navigate the archive. If someone in your life has hit a wall tracing a family line through the 1865-1872 period, the Bureau records are more navigable than most genealogical guides acknowledge. Send this to them before they give up on the trail. The labor contracts the Bureau negotiated are the second category of record that the genealogical literature consistently identifies as irreplaceable. Freed people who contracted with former enslavers or other landowners for agricultural labor in the years after emancipation signed, or marked with an X if they had not yet learned to write, contracts that the Bureau was required to witness and file. Those contracts named the laborer. They named the landowner. They specified the terms. They recorded, in many cases, the names of family members who would be working under the same agreement: wives, children, elderly parents. For a family tracing a line that goes silent before 1865, a Bureau labor contract from 1866 or 1867 can establish not only a name, but a location, a family composition, and a relationship to a specific piece of land. Information that makes the subsequent census records navigable in ways they would not otherwise be. Since maybe the Bureau's defunding in 1872 was simply a fiscal decision. An underfunded post-war government, making difficult choices about which programs it could sustain. If this were the whole picture, the story would be a familiar one about the limits of Reconstruction-era federal commitment to the freed people it had nominally liberated. But the record is more specific than that. The congressional debate over the Bureau's funding in 1871 and 1872 is documented in the congressional record. What it shows is not a legislature reluctantly cutting a program it valued but could not afford. It shows a legislature that had, by 1871, lost the political will to sustain Reconstruction itself, and that used the Bureau's budget as one of the instruments through which that political retreat was enacted. Archival patterns suggest the defunding was not primarily a fiscal calculation. It was a political one. The same congressional session that eliminated the Bureau's funding also began the legislative process that would, within a decade, effectively end federal enforcement of the 14th and 15th Amendments across the former Confederate states. The Bureau was not defunded because it had finished its work. It was defunded because the political coalition that had created it had decided to stop doing the work. The letters are where the record becomes hardest to read at a distance. The Bureau maintained a correspondence system through which freed people could submit written inquiries, dictated to a literate agent if they could not write themselves, requesting help locating family members who had been sold away during slavery. The letters named people. They named the states they had last been seen in. They named the enslavers who had sold them. They described physical characteristics, ages at the time of separation, the names of children who had been taken. The Bureau forwarded these letters to offices in the states where the missing persons were last known to have been held. Some letters reached their destination. Some generated responses. Some produced reunions that the Bureau's records document in specific detail. A name, a location, a date, a note in the agent's log that the inquiry had been resolved. Most did not. The volume of unanswered letters in the Bureau archive is not a measure of the Bureau's failure. It is a measure of the scale of what slavery had done to black families across 2.5 centuries. The deliberate, systematic, economically motivated destruction of family bonds that the domestic slave trade had enacted across every decade of American slavery's existence. The Bureau's correspondence system was attempting, in 6 years, with inadequate staff and funding, to locate people who had been separated across 15 states over generations. The archive could not close that gap. What it could do, what it did, was create a record that the gap had existed. That specific people had looked for specific other people. That the names were known, the separations were documented, the searches had been made. And here is where the record gets precise in a way that the standard accounts of the Bureau's closure do not fully capture. When Congress defunded the Bureau in 1872, the question of what would happen to the records it had generated was not prominently addressed in the defunding legislation. The Bureau's physical files, the labor contracts, the marriage registers, the letters of inquiry, the hospital logs, the ration records, were transferred to the War Department, where they were placed in storage. They were not indexed. They were not cataloged in any systematic way. They were not made accessible to the freed people whose names they contained, or to their descendants in any organized fashion. The records existed. Finding anything in them required knowing where to look, having access to a federal archive, and having the time and resources to search manually through unindexed paper files. For most Black American families in the decades following Reconstruction, navigating the specific and documented violence of Jim Crow, the disenfranchisement campaigns, the economic exclusion of sharecropping, those conditions were not available. The records survived. The access did not. The National Archives began a systematic effort to digitize and index the Freedmen's Bureau records in partnership with the Genealogical Society of Utah in the 1990s. The project accelerated significantly in 2015 and 2016 when a large-scale indexing effort, involving volunteer transcribers working through the Freedmen's Bureau Records Project, produced searchable indexes for millions of documents that had previously required in-person archival research to access. The records are now partially searchable online. Partially. The digitization is not complete. The indexing is not uniform across all states and all record types. The marriage registers for some states are fully indexed. For others, the index is partial or does not yet exist. If this investigation is landing differently than you expected, subscribe. The next one follows a different set of records that were built for a specific population, stored in a federal archive and made systematically difficult to access, in a different century, with a different population, and the same result. What the Bureau Correspondence Archive contains, in the letters that were filed, forwarded, and never answered, is the specific shape of what was lost. Not an abstraction, not a statistic, a name, a state, a description of a child last seen at age 7, sold south, not heard from since. The Bureau wrote it down. Congress closed the office. The letter is still in the file. The Bureau records are searchable in a way they have never been before. That is the specific fact that changes what this history means for any Black American family tracing a line that goes silent before 1870. The National Archives holds the original Bureau files. The Freedmen's Bureau Records Project, a collaboration between the Genealogical Society of Utah, Family Search, and volunteer indexers, has produced searchable transcriptions for millions of documents across multiple states. Labor contracts, marriage registers, ration rolls, letters of inquiry. A name that appears nowhere in the census record before 1870 may appear in a Bureau labor contract from 1866, attached to a location, a family composition, a former enslaver's name that opens the antebellum record. What the digitization project has not yet closed is the gap between the states where indexing is complete and the states where it is not. Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Georgia and Louisiana. The states where the domestic slave trade deposited the largest numbers of people sold from the Upper South, the states where the genealogical wall is highest, are the states where the Bureau record is least completely indexed. The work is ongoing. The archive is open. The records that Congress stopped maintaining in 1872 are still there, still specific, still containing names that no other government document recorded. The Bureau had 6 years. It was not enough time to document everything. It was enough time to document something, and something, in the context of a 200-year documentary silence, is the difference between a family that can trace its line and a family that cannot. Congress defunded the office. It could not unfund the names already written. The record survived the defunding. The question is whether the archive will survive the neglect.